We call upon all Canadians to denounce and speak out against violence against Indigenous women, girls, 2SLGBTQQIA people. Violence against Indigenous women, girls, 2SLGBTQQIA people is a national tragedy that's not only a historical phenomenon, but an ongoing crisis and a lived experience. Indigenous women are 3 times more likely to be victims of violence than non-Indigenous women in Canada. Indigenous women make up 11% of missing women and 16% of female homicide victims, despite Indigenous people making up 4% of the overall population of Canada. We call upon all Canadians, especially settlers and non-Indigenous individuals, in this call to justice, to not only support Indigenous people, but to also act and speak out against violence towards Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people.
What is violence? Violence against Indigenous women and girls is historical and ongoing. Their right to security and to feeling safe has been violated and will continue to be unless Canadians band together to stand up and denounce the violence against Indigenous peoples. To understand the framework of the violence experienced, we must understand what human security is. The UN created a Human Development Report that aimed at creating a non-exhaustive list of the facets of human security, being economic, health, personal, political, food, environmental, and community security. In 2012, this developed into a more detailed understanding that touches more on security during connections with the state or the authority. Indigenous women and girls deal with these violations of security every day and are so pervasive and embedded in our colonial system that creating safety and security for Indigenous women and girls will never be able to be a problem solved individually. This is why we call upon all Canadians to firstly be able to recognize violence against Indigenous women and girls and think critically about the ways in which the colonial system we currently uphold consequently harms others. Tracing a systemic issue is something that takes practice, and the more you practice critically thinking, the more you will understand the many ways in which violence is perpetuated against Indigenous women and girls. We need to understand that violence comes in many forms and can look different depending on one experience to the next, and will range from unconscious bias, stereotypes, microaggressions, to abuse, sexual assault, or murder. Violence also comes in the form of discrediting the experiences of Indigenous women and girls. So when Canadians ignore forms of violence against Indigenous women, it perpetuates the lack of security. We need to denounce all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls and advocate for justice for all with them.
There are systemic gaps in fulfilling the rights of Indigenous women. The federal government's inaction and unwillingness to fulfill the needs and rights of Indigenous women are in direct violation of their inherent rights as human beings. A human rights approach, rather than a victims-based approach, would be fundamental in shifting Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous women. A human rights-based approach would reframe issues of importance to Indigenous women as a denial of rights, rather than unfulfilled needs. Therefore, exposure to violence would be interpreted as a systemic violation of the rights to gender equality and non-discrimination. Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people are holders of inherent rights to culture, health, security, and justice. These rights are all interconnected with one another. When one is not fulfilled, it can contribute to the targeting of Indigenous women and 2SLGBTQQIA people. As reported by the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Executive Summary report, there are 4 pathways that maintain colonial violence. This includes historical, multi-generational, and intergenerational trauma, social and economic marginalization, maintaining the status quo and lack of institutional will, and ignoring the agency and expertise of Indigenous women, girls, and 2SLGBTQQIA people.
There are three key considerations that non-Indigenous people need to be aware of if we are to respectfully acknowledge and speak out against the horrific experiences and devastating impacts of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual people. First, we need to break the silence and end the stigma. This entails listening carefully to those most affected so we can begin to understand the impact and root cause of this violence. These are challenging conversations to have, and when engaging in them, we must avoid pushing settler perspectives and processes onto Indigenous communities. Instead, we must center the needs, experiences, and wisdom of Indigenous voices. We need to listen with open minds and hearts to better understand how these oppressive, violent life experiences disrupt and harm traditional Indigenous knowledge and cultural ways of being. Second, consider how settler and Indigenous encounters impact the relationships we share. We need to create more positive, respectful, shared experiences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. This will help when we lean into the harder discussions. Encounters shaped around sharing traditions, cultures, skills, foods, and stories within a community setting will produce more positive experiences, which help build stronger relationships between all people. Third, recognizing that redefining Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationships stretch far beyond the personal. The colonial, patriarchal, and heteronormative beliefs woven deep within the institutional structures of our society place Indigenous people in a deep socioeconomic margin, a place where dismissive attitudes and violence become the norm within the relationships we've imposed on them. We see this play out clearly in present day within our colonial forms of government and policing. We must acknowledge our own participation, conscious or not, in the oppressive and violent systems and structures still actively working in place today. In conclusion, when settlers take the initiative to re-educate themselves and foster more positive encounters by opening up to meaningful conversations and relationships with Indigenous peoples, the harmful colonial structures and systems become more evident. One way of many that listeners can engage in these learning opportunities would be to attend the annual gatherings of the Moose Hide Campaign. The Moose Hide Campaign invites Indigenous and non-Indigenous men to take a pledge to end violence against women and children. Everyone is encouraged to wear a pin in an act of solidarity, a way to interrupt the narrative and share a new one. I encourage all listeners to go to the Moose Hide Campaign website, learn more, order your pins, and get the conversation going. We call on all Canadians to educate themselves on the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual people, and become actively committed to their protection.